Very much for the kind invitation from the Sudan Doctors Union. It's my great pleasure to be here today, so thank you very much for having me. So, just note, I may end up sitting down halfway through the talk because I've got a slightly sore heel, but we'll see how that goes. But I'm here today to talk to you about the upcoming, well, the recently released book I'm an author on, Sudan's Unfinished Democracy, which I'm an author on with Justin Lynch, a journalist who was covering the revolution in Sudan, Rajar Makari of African Arguments, and Alex Roll of the World Peace Foundation. So, so it's largely a book about the momentous 2018 to 2019 revolutionary period. We've got chapters on the rise of the protest movement, on the political economy of the revolution, on the military counter-revolution that occurred after the fall of the regime, and taking us right up to roughly November 2021. In fact, we ended up halting this book going to press and ended up almost entirely rewriting the conclusion due to the October 25 coup in 2021. So, however, since it's just me here today, I'm going to be talking about the chapter I was the principal author of, which is the 5th chapter on history, entitled More Than History Repeating Itself, ? So, part of the reason I was involved in writing this chapter is I wrote another book, Khartoum Springs, Civil Uprisings in Modern Sudan, on the 1964 October Revolution and 1985 April Intifada, which incidentally is currently being translated into Arabic, so that should be available in Arabic soon. So a lot of my contribution to this book was that kind of comparative analysis of the 3 famous revolutions in Sudan's post-independence history: 1964, 1985, and 2018 to 2019. So I'm going to start off, first of all, with a little bit of context on these revolutions and Sudan's post-independence political history in general. So, revolution number 1, the October Revolution, happens in 1964, when a civilian movement led by a body known as the Professional Front overthrows the first military regime of Ibrahim Aboud. The Professional Front, socially heterogeneous but ideologically eclectic, spawned the October generation, and the workings out of the inner conflicts of that generation, the October generation, would define Sudanese politics for the next 50 years. Notably, the clashes between political secularists and left-wingers and liberals, and the more socially conservative, nationalist and religiously orientated parties, brought down the first transitional government following the October Revolution, and then the first parliamentary government. When the religious parties outlawed the Sudan Communist Party following allegations of atheism, and then a faction of the communists and revolutionary Arab socialists cooperated with their counterparts in the military to overthrow the democratic system, establishing the May regime of Jafar Numeri in 1969. Although Numeri's regime starts off in alliance with the political left, he ruthlessly clamps down on the Sudan Communist Party after an abortive coup in 1971, and then reconciles with the religious right in 1977, introducing the famous September laws, at least ostensibly according to the regime's narrative based on Sharia law, in 1983. The 1985 Intifada, which was spearheaded by the professional unions and of course famously the Sudan Doctors Union, was a reaction to Nimeri's shift to the right. But following a one-year transitional period, the new parliamentary regime under Sadiq al-Mahdi vacillated over whether or not to reverse many of Nimeri's measures, including, notably, the September laws. The military coup launched by Umar al-Bashir and the National Islamic Front in 1989 was in many ways the kind of counter, the more comprehensive reaction to the 1985 Intifada, with professional and labour activists who'd led the protests being targeted in ruthless purges, following the introduction of the Islamist system, or the empowerment or tamkeen process. For nearly 30 years, al-Bashir ruled through a mix of violence, repression and tactical bargaining with local, regional and international actors before being overthrown by the third major revolution in Sudan's post-independence history in 2019. So, what I'm going to look at now is why each of these movements followed a similar trajectory, and then how and why each movement might, or why the most recent movement might break away from that trajectory today. And as I go into this analysis, I would ask you to bear in mind that I wrote the bulk of this in late 2019, probably early 2020, and of course there's been a lot of developments since. I've tried to update my talk slightly to incorporate some of these developments, but maybe some of the, how would I put it, some of the more optimistic tone of some of the analysis I'll maybe revise as I go along. So, broadly, I'm going to talk about this historic model of conservative transition, radical revolution in 64 and 85, followed by conservative transition, and why it's played out in this way. So one commonality of the 1964, 1985 and 2019 movements is that in each case, a faction within the security forces helps to oust the existing military rulers and then attempts to safeguard a conservative transition that marginalises the most radical actors. The internal dynamics of this internal conservative transition within the security forces has differed on each occasion, but the obstinacy of the security forces as a collective set of actors and their desire to bolster their political and economic status has not. In 1965, a faction of middle-ranking officers seized the day to prevent the junior radicals associated with the Free Officer movement coming into the fore. And then they shaped the transition to the parliamentary democracy. The Free Officers then, in alignment with those radical revolutionary Arab socialists and some factions within the Sudan Communist Party, backed their own coup in 1969, dissolving themselves into Nimeri's regime. In 1985, the military command, under Suar al-Dahab as Chief of Staff, intervened to prevent any radical action by separate Ba'athist, Islamist and entirely different Free Officer faction under Abdulaziz Khaled, steering the revolution in another direction. And there's this conservative transition model again in 1985. And then, obviously there's a shift within the military in 1989, where for the previous kind of 30 years, the military having been this playing field where various political factions, Baathists, Islamists, Communists, the Umar Party, all have a stake. After 1989, Umar al-Bashir purges the military quite comprehensively of non-Islamist elements, which is why it's notable that when the military interventions happen in 2019, it's actually factions being backed by regional actors. Obviously, we all know the role of the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and generals Bahan and Himeti that come to the fore, rather than people aligned with any particular political movement. So in each case, there were radical factions among the young officers, but either the senior officers or the formal military leadership intervened to prevent the revolution moving in a more radical direction. The pattern here is that in each case, the military have struck bargains with the more conservative political actors in an effort to de-radicalise the revolution. And this brings us to the history of those kind of, how would I put it? Various terms have been used to describe the Umar Party and the Democratic Unionist Party. They're sometimes, particularly Biannualists on the left, referred to as the sectarian parties, sometimes conservative nationalists, centre-right, the religiously orientated parties, the Sufi-backed parties, sometimes the term is used. But the Umar and the Democratic Unionist Party have had this pattern where you have a kind of coalitional movement in 64, 85, where these political parties align themselves with the urban revolution, with the role of the unions, with the role of the students in bringing down the regime, but then have very different perspectives on how the transition is going to unfold. This was particularly the case in 1965, when the transition arrives, historically 64-85, there's been these different approaches to the transition between the more conservative parties, Umar, DUP, who tend to push for a quick move towards one person, one vote elections, and the more radical factions, the unions, historically the Baathists, the Sudan Communist Party, want to use the transitional period to engineer both a more radical social transformation and a removal of the traces of the authoritarian military regime. So again, we see how this tension plays out in the first transitional period, 64 to 65, when Sadiq al-Mahdi of the Umar Party effectively engineers the downfall of the first transitional government, which was quite a left-leaning transitional government with many representatives of the professional front in it, and brings in a relatively more conservative regime which ushers in one-man, one-vote elections dominated by the Umar Party. In 1985, the Umar Party and the Democratic Unionists strike a deal with the professionals that there'll be a 3-year transitional period, then almost immediately strike another deal with the military that there'll be a 1-year transitional period, and as we know, it's the 1-year transitional period that results. And again, in 2018 to 2019, before his passing from coronavirus, Sadiq al-Mahdi was the individual most eager to strike a deal with the military that would undermine the professional groupings and have a much shorter transitional period, leading more swiftly to elections. And again, this is me updating the chapter here because this content isn't in the book, but with more recent events. Following the passing of Sadiq al-Mahdi, his stand-in successor, Fadlallah Nasir, a ghost of transitions past, played a major role in securing the widely rejected Hamdok-Bahan deal almost immediately following the October 21 coup. And more recently, the Ummah Party has been a major backer of the, how do I put it, not quite as widely rejected, not necessarily widely accepted. I'll wait to hear your thoughts on this. The recent framework agreement that was signed in December 2022. But anyway, a notable pattern both in past and present is that the Ummah has struck deals with the military that, again, notably in 1964 to 1965, ensuring that the then generals were not subject to transitional justice. Again, downplaying transitional justice has been a major role, has been a major element of this recent framework deal in 2022. So that's one historic pattern in the Conservative transition. Another important factor in the Conservative transition was the marginalisation of the most radical of the professional groupings in each transition. The eventual toppling of the first October transitional government, which I mentioned, was an example of this, and another important example was in 1985, where Jazuli Dafala of the Doctors' Union went on to become leader of the National Alliance. Himself, Jazuli Dafala, becomes the interim Prime Minister. Himself, although he was the leader of the Doctors' Union at the time, one of the more conservative figures within it, and the more radical professionals go on to form their own union alliance, which is more marginalised from the transitional government, which doesn't accept many of its demands about returning workers dismissed by Jafar Numeri. Okay, and retains many of Numeri-era bosses, the mini Numeris in every workplace. Finally, another central element of the Conservative transition historically was the ongoing regional marginalisation, the marginalisation of the regions, and the conflict in the most marginalised peripheries. Part of the problem in 1964 was that by raising the slogan of the modern forces, that was of course the term in 1964, Al-Qawat al-Khalifa, the October movement empowered those sectors of the economy that had been transformed most comprehensively in the context of colonial modernity, and notably the cash crop-orientated Gezira scheme, and the railway workers who managed to, the railway workers involved in the process of export to the world market were the ones that had the power to bring Sudan's economy to a crippling halt, whereas the subsistence farmers and pastoralists of Sudan's marginalised peripheries did not have as significant a role in the October movement. In both 1964 and 1985, rebellion was ongoing in the south. The now seceded south that is now the independent nation of South Sudan. But the Sudan rebellion at the time was not exactly coordinated with the urban civil protests. And in both cases, as you transition to the parliamentary governments, the 65 to 69 parliamentary government, the 86 to 89 parliamentary government, war continued in southern Sudan. And that was in part possible because of the close relationship between the political parties that had struck the deal on the conservative transition and the security forces. Now, all of this leads to the question was, how different was 2018 to 2019, and how different can the subsequent transitions still be? I think one thing that is worth saying is that although 1964 and 1985 were definitely mass revolutions, the scope of popular mobilisation today, at its peak, was arguably far greater than ever before. And to go back to this comparative analysis of the revolutions, okay, we look at 1965. There's that moment I mentioned where Sadiq al-Mahdi effectively engineers the downfall of the leftist first transitional regime. What happens then is that the Sudan Communist Party and its allies in the unions try to mobilise another general strike against that, but eventually that doesn't work. And divested of the support of most of the political parties, it's not able to prevent the other party marching its supporters from Sudan's regions into Khartoum and effectively forcing the political left out of power in Khartoum. 1985, Sirah al-Dahab and the Transitional Military Council are able to impose a ban on further protests within a month of taking over. Of course, it's not always heeded, the ban, but it's much stricter legislation. However, in 2019, the protests continued even after the formation of today's Transitional Military Council. And despite the efforts of the other party, and I'm going back to 2019 here, the events of 2019, despite the politics that was played then, where Sadiq al-Mahdi and the other party reached out to Hemeti and Bahan and wouldn't take part in the general strike of 30th of June 2019, because the base of popular mobilisation in 2019 went well beyond the classic revolutionary front organisations of the unions, the Sudan Communist Party, the Baathists, the unions. In 2019, you had this much socially broader revolutionary movement, in effect, that incorporated yes, the professional and the labour unions, but also youth groups, the informal economy, or various organisations which I'll mention in a second, representing the marginalised regions, the urban lumpen proletariat, Facebook activists, women's groups. This very kind of coalitional and diverse revolutionary movement meant that it was much harder for the more conservative actors to move against the radical urbanites than it was in 1965 and 1985. So, okay. So what I'm going to do now is look at the three main factors which, again, I say this, I was writing around 2019 to 2020, which explain why the dynamics of the 2018 to 2019 uprising and subsequent transition might play out in a somewhat different way today. So these are the factors. First of all, the marginalised regions effectively a nearer Khartoum socially and politically in 1964 and 1985 than in 1964 and 1985, suggesting a potential end to the old dichotomy between armed rebellion in the peripheries and civil protest at the centre. which has been discussed so much in Sudan's history. Secondly, women have mobilised even more effectively than during previous uprisings, challenging their gendered marginalisation, both under the al-Bashir regime and in society at large, as well as the patriarchal modes of authority that have underpinned authoritarian politics in Sudan. Thirdly, 30 years of the Islamists in power have both engendered widespread popular hostility towards Islamism as a political model, and exposed on a more intellectual and political level the flaws in the Islamist project. Okay. But now I'm going to talk about this theme of periphery and centre. Again, the terms periphery and centre get used a lot in the kind of social and political analysis of 20th and 21st century Sudanese history. But one of the most common themes is that political scientists, and I'm thinking particularly of an article Alex Duval wrote in 2013, have identified this kind of disjuncture or dichotomy between two modes of resistance in Sudan. Armed resistance in the marginalised regions, by which we might mean Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, the south before secession, and arguably the east too. That dichotomy between armed resistance in the marginalised regions and civil resistance in Khartoum and the various cities, towns and cities of the urban riverine core. Of course, and that led to this historic pattern where the army negotiates with civilian parties at the centre and civilian actors at the centre and armed actors on the periphery, of which the recent Juba peace agreement is an obvious example. Of course, I don't want to make this model too inflexible, because history does yield plenty of examples of civil protests within what we refer to as the marginalised regions. During the October Revolution in Darfur, there were mass civil protests in Nyala, in Al-Fashir, which led to the rise of the first and most prominent Darfuri regionalist organisations like Jabhat Nahdat al-Darfur. Back then, however, the considerable distance, geographic distance, between Darfur and the riverine centre, and the fact that the initial revolutionary period before Ibrahim Aboud was toppled in October 1964 was the fact that it was so brief, only 5 days in earnest, meant that the civil protest in Darfur in particular and in the east wasn't able to have as significant an impact on what were conservative Khartoum-centred transitions as has been the case today. Today, 21st century communications technology has shortened distances and given demonstrations in marginalised regions much more opportunity to have an impact. Whereas the 1964 and 1985 movements were led by students and professionals from predominantly riverine backgrounds, now the social base of the student class in Sudan has expanded considerably, and groups like the Darfur Student Association and Nuba Mountain Student Union, for instance, are ever stronger and more vocal as players in revolutionary politics. And there's another parallel development, which is that the politics of, while the politics of the periphery is shaping the politics of civil protest in the Riverine Centre, the methods and goals of civil protest are penetrating the periphery as well, altering that old dichotomy between peaceful opposition at the centre and armed rebellion at the margins. Locally based campaigns, such as the campaign against toxic gold mining in South Kordofan, led to solidarity marches in Khartoum. Meanwhile, the armed rebel movements themselves recognised the power of civil protest and withdrew from peace talks to show solidarity with the civilian uprising in 2018 to 2019. And of course we saw the rise of the Juba Peace Agreement. And of course why the Juba Peace Agreement appeared so promising initially was it broke this historic pattern. It appeared to break this historic pattern in which 64 to 65, 85 to 86, you did not have a peace deal struck during the transition. And that was partly why the military were able to continue justifying themselves as dominant political actors during the parliamentary periods in which the civil war was ongoing. So, from this perspective, the Juba Peace Agreement was historically unprecedented, certainly insofar as it incorporated the majority, if not all, of the rebel movements that had been fighting the former regime. But of course, in the year or so that followed, we discovered the political challenges that the Juba Peace Agreement had created. The Juba Peace Agreement, as many people have said, was the classic payroll peace. Thanks so much. Was the classic payroll peace with armed rebels with this massive project to incorporate armed rebels into the military, but that led to the question of what is this even more substantial collection of armed actors in Khartoum, obviously including the Rapid Support Forces as well, going to do now? And eventually, as we know, with the 25th of October 2021 coup, two of the armed signatories of the Juba Peace Agreement, two of the most prominent armed signatories of the Juba Peace Agreement, the Justice and Equality Movement and the Sudan Liberation Army Mini-Manawi faction, aligned themselves with the coup that ousted the civilians from the transitional government. And again, this raised a lot of questions for the civil actors about the pitfalls of belligerent-dominated peace processes. I remember shortly after the coup, I read a statement by the Sudan Professional Association spokesman talking to a Jarida newspaper, and he said, you have to stop thinking of the armed rebels as the representatives of the marginalised regions. You need to move beyond the rebels and talk directly to the communities they claim to represent. In effect, you need a civil politics in the marginalised regions as well as at the centre. And of course, this is a considerable political challenge for civil actors in Sudan when, for the last 30 years, a variety of international actors have been backing belligerent-dominated peace processes. And one of the few counter-examples to that model from the research I'm doing currently on the role of the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel in Sudan was that panel's plan for a political process in Darfur, which was going to involve civil dialogue between civil society actors and various other civil actors in Darfur in the late 2000s, which was ultimately bypassed by the Doha process in Darfur, showing the difficulty of having civil politics in Darfur in the same way that you do in Khartoum. Okay. So, again, that little section I've delivered there, again, that starts off a little bit more optimistically, and then obviously I've discussed some of the reasons for pessimism in connection with the October 2021 coup. But let's move on to another area in which Sudan could break away from the mould of previous transitions, related to a broader social transition that's occurring in terms of the gender order. So there's been a great deal of focus on women's role and women's mobilisation during the 2018 to 2019 movement, which is of course isn't particularly novel, because of course there were women mobilised en masse in 1964 and 1985. There were some famous breakthroughs, such as the fact that women got universal franchise after the 1964 October Revolution, and famously Fatima Ahmad Ibrahim became the first female MP. But I think what's been different in 2018 to 2019 and subsequently is the extent to which women moved from participating in the mobilisation to making demands as women and challenging these broader patriarchal structures. If you look at a lot of the narratives about 1964 and 1985, I think, and there's a parallel here with similar nationalist movements elsewhere in the era, there's a tendency to subsume women's agency within a broader national agency. But today, a lot of the breakthroughs women have been making are touching on more broader social issues, notably the outlawing of female genital cutting or female genital mutilation by the transitional government was an example of this. And another notable difference at the same time is that while much of the international media, I'm thinking of one particularly famous image here, focused on middle-class women in Khartoum, marginalised women have also come to the fore, notably the Tea Ladies, and the Tea Ladies' famous role in supporting and helping the protesters. Our dear Mahmoud Kuku, the head of the Tea Sellers Union in Sudan, was celebrated by Sudanese activists as the first lady of the revolution for her role at the sit-in site, the famous sit-in site, and that's significant. Although, as Abdulaziz and El Faki note in their recent text, which discusses women's roles during the uprising, again, there's still disparities insofar as protesters in Khartoum and Medani are maybe focusing on practicing FGMC, whereas women in the peripheries are more focused on facing extreme poverty, displacement, insecurity. So women's activism in the revolution has not been the same everywhere. Okay, I'll come to another, whoopsie. Maybe I won't take a risk with that. I'll come to another. Thank you. Okay, I'll come to a third factor now, which the third factor which might explain why the revolution today has in some regards been different, might break from the pattern. Again, I'm partly talking with my optimism from 2019 to 2020 here, but this is the idea that there might be an end to Islamist politics. And another novel fact in the 2019 transition was this possibility of the eclipse of Islamism. Now, I mean, if we're talking about things that are path-breaking about the 2018 to 2019 revolution, not just in Sudan, but also regionally, this is the first example of a civilian protest movement that has unseated an Islamist regime. Everybody's been analysing movements in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, but of course this is the first movement to unseat an Islamist regime. Of course, we're seeing what's going on in Iran at the moment, but we don't know how that will pan out. But this is what makes Sudan in 2018 to 2019 significant. And if we look even in comparison with Sudan's own revolutionary history, 64, 85, Islamist 64, 85, you see that the professional movements were split between Islamist and leftist factions. I mean, Hassan al-Turabi himself, who engineered the 1989 coup, was himself in and about the Sudan the professional front in 1964. Jazuli Dafala being the obvious example in 1985. Whereas the contrast today is that within the professional movement, the professional anti-regime movement, the Islamists have been eclipsed more comprehensively than before. And within the Sudan Professional Association, if there is a split in the Sudan Professional Association today, it's not really so much between the Islamist and leftist groups, it's between the centre-left and the hard-left within the Sudan Professional Association. So that's obviously a difference. Jazuli Dafala, who in many ways was the engineer of the 1985 conservative transition, February 2019, as the revolution's ongoing, brings up his own initiative, which I think was called the Peace and Reform Initiative, effectively trying to put forward a model for another conservative transition. And effectively, that political move was swept away amidst the revolutionary tide. So this is a significant difference. And with many of the senior leadership in the Islamic movement, obviously Umar al-Bashir himself, but even within the Popular Congress Party, Ibrahim Sanusi, Ali al-Hajj, I believe they're still being tried for their role in the 1989 coup. The Islamists are very much on the back front in the current transition. This said, and of course I'm going to have to qualify this, there are a number of means the Islamists have had and still have for retaining ongoing influence. The first is the survival of the Islamist media empire. I mean, if you look what's happened with media today in the current transition, if you compare it with 1985, for instance, in 1985, Nimeri had basically two state-controlled, state-taken-over newspapers. And during the transition, they were returned to their original owners. And that was fairly straightforward. Since then, you've had this flourishing Islamist media empire. I mean, I could mention all kinds of names, which you'll know: Al-Intibaha, Al-Sayha, Al-Sudani, just to name a few of them, as well as the Islamists taking over some of the historic newspapers. And because it's not really and today it's not been as straightforward as simply like placing a newspaper that the state took over back into the hands of its original owners. You have all these newspaper organs like Al-Intibaha that are nominally private enterprise, I mean closer to being parastatal, but nominally private enterprise. And this was the great challenge. I mean, when people talk of dismantling the deep state, it wasn't just the security services, it was like the media was part of that. And we see, obviously, they're still around. I mean, Al-Intibaha is probably the most notable of all of them, but if you look at Al-Intibaha 2021, Al-Intibaha, Al-Tayyib Mustafa was fulminating against a member of the transitional government in the education ministry, Umar Agaray, mobilising takfiris against him. And again, it's Al-Intibaha's role in the coup that happened in October 2021 that shows another dynamic the Islamists have exploited historically and might continue to exploit, which is this classic dichotomy I've talked about so much already, which is the dichotomy between the revolution in the centre and the revolution in the marginalised regions. And the most notable example of this was, well, when Al-Intibaha started publicising the unrest led by Nazir Said Tariq in eastern Sudan in an attempt to destabilise the first transitional government. Eventually, Al-Intibaha, I believe, was briefly shut down for that, but eventually that unrest led up to the coup. And it shows one of those historic dynamics, which is that, I mean, whereas historically, a lot of the revolutionary politics was about establishing revolutionary social transformation in the regions. The resistance committee charters are obviously a recent example of this. Dismantling the system of native administration was obviously a major slogan in 1964. Particularly, the Islamists have often favoured empowering what we might call either the native administration actors, the quote-unquote neo-traditional actors in the regions. And obviously, Nazir Tariq in eastern Sudan was an example of that, a more recent example of that. And then finally, because I've discussed quite a few examples here, and I haven't even mentioned the Islamist stranglehold on the economy and elements of the security services yet, and the fact that many Islamists were returned to their roles in the security services and the civil service following the October 2021 coup. The other core strategy is the kind of strategy that Islamists were already developing before the revolution. Because if you look at the historic pattern, whenever the political left in Sudan has been at its strongest, the Islamists have tended less to go it alone and more to act as influencers of broader, more socially conservative politics in Sudan. The obvious example was in the 1960s, where the Islamist political strategy was to work against the communists and the revolutionary Arab nationalists through influencing the democratic unionists, through influencing the National Ummah Party, or the Ummah Party as it was then. 1989, the Islamists decide they want to go it alone and get rid of almost every other political faction in Sudan, including the Ummah and the DUP. And you obviously see Islamist politics in Sudan at its most hubristic, its most devastating in the 1990s, before the Islamists realised that their own, the Mashru' al-Hadari, the civilizational project, was a disaster, and start trying to go back to the old politics of the 1960s in a way, and saying, okay, we're going to have to start using the Ummah Party, the Democratic Unionists as fronts. And you saw this going on to some extent before the regime fell, famously like that moment where Bashir appointed al-Mirghani and al-Mahdi's sons as presidential advisors, and it was part of al-Turabi's plan for a successor regime. And I guess during the current transition, again, what we've seen is this politics whereby parties like the National Ummah Party, which as a party has yo-yoed between the kind of anti-regime left and the Islamists throughout its history, has again started, again, the recent framework agreements is an example, and the fact that the Ummah Party and the Popular Congress Party seem to have been aligning themselves a bit more closely through it. That's another obvious example. The Popular Congress Party, of course, it's still there as a political actor. The political vision it's kind of been projecting ever since 1999, and ever since 1999 is that, okay, we're going to move to a kind of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, al-Mahda, Tunisia, reformist Islamism model. And in some regards, its kind of political rehabilitation within the transition might be an example of that. But within the Sudanese context, of course, I think it's also part of its politics of aligning itself with, as it has at various points in history, with what we refer to as the quote-unquote sectarian parties, the Ummah, the DUP. Okay, do I have any time left, or should I had one last slide on theories of revolution. Shall I do it?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So before we end, I want to reflect a little on exactly what kind of revolution the Sudanese revolution was. And I've put the various models here. I've put the resistance committees in there specifically as an addition to the discussion I had in the book, because the resistance committee charters weren't as politically prominent when I wrote the chapter as they are now. So that's one ongoing edit, I suppose. So various models of revolution. Obviously, in the context of post-independence Africa, one famous model of revolution is Frantz Fanon, the wretched of the earth. In some regards, Sudan's revolutions don't neatly fit in to the Fanonian model. And I suppose I say this, you can make a distinction between Sudan's revolutions as they played out and Sudan's revolutions at their most, how would I put it, at their most ambitious and radical and revolutionary point. But in terms of how the revolutions in 64 and 85, and I suppose increasingly 2018 to 2019 played out, they don't necessarily fit into the Fanonian model. because a lot of Frantz Fanon's political philosophy in Wretched of the Earth was about escaping the urban domination of the revolutionary movement, seeing the countryside as the true source of revolutionary culture, and the cities as hallmarks of Western colonial modernity that had to be challenged. And Fanon himself was actually quite critical of unions as political actors, because his perception was that unions had a symbiotic relationship with colonial structures. And in that sense, the urban bias of Sudan's revolutionary movements does distinguish them from the classic Fanonian model, as does the emphasis on peaceful protest and silmia, in that a lot of Fanonian analysis didn't exactly justify, but saw violence and understood violence as an inevitable function of anti-colonial revolution. Now, as I say, I wrote that in 2019. The only thing I'd add as a kind of follow-up to that is that since then we've had the charters of the resistance committees, and one of the most interesting elements for resistance committees' charters is that they are aspiring to this broader social transformation, and a lot of, there were two charters, and the Wad Madani charter was maybe slightly, and they were both radical in their own way. The Wad Madani charter was maybe slightly more radical than the Khartoum one. A lot of the focus on both, there were a lot of critiques of the native administration and the role of the British colonial state in setting it up, and there was a lot of focus on the structural imbalances between town and countryside in those charters. So maybe that was a context in which actually the Sudanese revolutionary movement was aspiring to that more radical structural transformation. Okay, final comparisons. Was it a vanguardist revolution? Was the Sudanese revolution a vanguardist revolution on the kind of classic Marxist-Leninist vanguard model? And I think the straightforward answer is no. Actually, if you look at Sudanese history, the more vanguardist revolutions have tended to be less the 58 and more the 69 and 89 military coups. Famously, the 69 coup was supported by some members of the Sudan Communist Party, others were definitely opposed to it, who had a more vanguardist outlook. 89, I think it's, I might be wrong about this, but I think it's Dawal and Abdul Salam that refer to Hassan al-Turabi as the Islamist Lenin. Actually that Leninist model, emphasizing the vanguardist movements and is closer to explaining military coups. If you look, there was no single leader in 64, 85 or 2019 who was, in terms of having a comprehensive mass following, who was as influential as, for instance, Hassan al-Turabi was within the Islamic movement. These were... Turabi, for instance, exercised some element of charismatic agency in 64, but he could never acquire as much power through his movement and his charismatic supporters as he did through his initial role in al-Bashir's regime. Famously, of course, he was not voted in 1986 in the parliamentary elections, and because of that, he went for the military coup in 1989. So the actual revolutionary movements weren't vanguardists, they were more coalitional. Can we understand Sudan's revolution in terms of the country's political economy? Can can it be understood as a revolution within an agrarian system, like historic revolutions in Russia, China and France, or in opposition to a rentier state, as in Iran? Well, not really. Sudan was an oil rentier state for a period between 1999 and 2011, but that wasn't when any of the uprisings happened. And by 2018 to 2019, the historic agrarian system had been very thoroughly marginalised and by market-orientated capitalism. If you're going to apply a political economy analysis to the revolution, chapter 2, of which Alex Duval is, was I think the principal author, discusses the political and economy models and how the rise of gold mining at Darfur empowered General Hemeti and the Rapid Support Forces. So I think that's relevant in terms of the militia economy. But insofar as the civic protest movements of 1964 and 1985 and 2019 were revolutions, which I think is a term we can justify, we can agree with Theda Skocpol's minimalist definition of revolutions as, and I quote, complex conjunctures of unfolding conflicts involving differently situated and motivated and at least minimally organised groups. And I think that describes the Sudanese revolution and its coalitional nature very well. To have brought together so many disparate groups as it has through primarily non-violent means to achieve a consensus on democratic transition is what makes the Sudanese revolution remarkable. It's all the more remarkable for the fact that this is the third time this has happened in Sudan, including twice in 64 and 85, at a time when the literature on both Middle Eastern and African studies was very much arguing that Cold War, authoritarianism and civil war were what dominated politics in both Africa and the Middle East in this period. Leaving Sudan neglected in the literature on non-violent movements. And hopefully this neglect will cease. And this book aspires to be a small part of that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Willow Berridge, for this really fascinating talk, and it's comprehensive tracking for our history and vision circle since 1964. So I'm going to open the questions for the floor and comments.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview of the history of the revolutions in Sudan. I have two questions, if I may. The first one is, you've studied the history in Sudan very well, and my question is, would there be any other expected outcome on the 11th of April 2019 in terms of, there are a lot of theories about what would have and what could have been done through history. Does that tell us that there would have been any other outcome than the outcome that has transpired on the 11th of April 2019? And the second question is, given all the factions or whatever happens these days in Sudan, I know no one can really tell what's going to happen tomorrow, or the week after, or the year after, but is there any, through you studying the history of Sudan and comparing to the other revolutions and things like that, are there any, anything to make us optimistic about the future in Sudan?
They're both great questions. I think I'll come to the last question about optimism first, because I love being optimistic. And I think what I will say is, in my feeling, I mean, having written about 64 and 85, and having been in Sudan at that, writing that, I suppose I wrote that between about, when would it be, 2012 and 2015. Writing about those revolutions then, I think people almost like felt felt afraid to believe that it could happen again. And I think it's almost like that's gone away now, and people are mobilised, have been mobilised in a way that was certainly not the case before the Bashir regime. And even if you contrast it to 64 and 85, in a way, what's been promising is the length of the radical transition. Like 64, it was a 6-month transitional period. 85 to 86, it was a 1-year transitional period. I guess, well, the transition has now gone on since April 2019, so let me do some quick mental maths. It's coming up to 3 years. And of course it's had major stalls at various points. And I guess there maybe is more pessimism now than there was in April 2019. But there's still a heck of a lot more open public discussion than there was before. People are still a lot, maybe not as much relative to April 2019, but relative to 2018, people still have a much greater capacity to mobilise on the street. Again, I'm wary of saying too much about the current framework agreement because I don't know how it's going to play out. So if I get us into I suppose the most optimistic scenario is that this does genuinely lead to the military stepping aside and you have a transition to democracy. I think probably the best case scenario with the framework agreement that's happening currently is you get a kind of, I suppose, 64 to 65 replay, but different, where the military do formally step aside politically, but act as major influencers behind the scenes on whichever political faction wins in the parliamentary elections. And that's obviously not a great scenario for the revolution, but that would then have but then at least at the minimum you would potentially in that scenario hope to have a pluralistic democracy with more rights at least to challenge the military than you did under Omar Bashir. So I guess that's the best case scenario as far as I can see for how this current dynamic plays out. What else should I say? Okay, on how April 2019 could have been different. Oh, thanks very much. On how April 2019 could have been different. As a historian, I'm always wary of counterfactuals because it gets me into trouble. What would have made April 2019 different? I guess, I know the dynamic that's been talked a lot about recently, because I read a piece by Amjad Farid in the Africa Report as I was on my way down here, which was criticising the embrace of the rapid support forces and the belief that you could use the rapid support forces to effectively sweep aside the Islamists and then not have to worry about the rapid support forces after that. So I guess, and I'm getting into horrible counterfactuals here, I guess the alternative play in 2019 would be that there was that moment on sort of April 11th and April 12th, 2019, where all the different security actors were frantically meeting each other and phoning each other, like Salah Ghosh and Himeti and the military leadership. And it turned out that Himeti was a major player, in part because of his grip on Sudan's gold economy at the time, in part because the the forces of freedom and change in the early period of the revolution, I think this is something I do briefly mention in the book, had made that calculation that we'll describe, this was Yasser Arman's own words at the time, we'll describe Himeti and Bahan as potential allies of the revolution, and they're our allies in getting rid of the Islamists. And that was the calculation that was made. And now, of course, you have Himeti and Bahan to deal with. So, I guess what would the alternative have been then? And again, I don't know the immediate obvious answer to that. Could there have been a different faction in the military, like Yasser al-Attah's faction, that would have been a more pliable actor, and would that faction in the military have ever been able to get any political weight behind it? I guess that would maybe have been the ideal alternative play in April 2019. But I'm getting into counterfactual history, which historians aren't supposed to do. Any more questions?
How
Thank you.
how far do you think that the interference or conspiracy of regional and international forces in Sudan, I mean, in trying to take the revolution to one side?
Okay, so you effectively talk about the role of the US. When you say international forces, are we basically all of them? US, EU, United Arab Emirates,
Egypt, Emirates,
Saudi Arabia, all that kind of
Chatham House.
And
and
Israel.
Chatham House.
Okay, so
Israel, yeah. And Israel.
Israel, all the international actors. Okay, I mean, obviously, this is something that is different in 2018 to 2019. Certainly in contrast with 64. I mean, I remember when I talked to Cyril Al-Dahab when I wrote my first book. He said, "Oh, the reason I was able to clamp down on the unions in 1985 was I went to the Emiratis and the Gulf states and managed to secure a political deal to rehabilitate the economy, and that was why I was able to clamp down on the general strike so quickly then." So there's a pattern of that. Okay, so how do I summarise this all? Because there have been so many interventions, right? And the basic pattern, I suppose, is this kind of political realist outlook. I mean, realism as a political philosophy, which emphasises, which has prioritised belligerent-dominated peace processes and hasn't really respected Sudan's history of civic mobilisation. I mean, what you've really seen, and particularly, I mean, first example in July 2019, was it July or August 2019, you have the first deal that leads to the transitional government. And if you look at the role of the internationals in that, then the Hamdok-Bahan deal, November 2021, and the international reaction to that, the most striking element of it is the language that's used about agreements struck between civilian protest movements and the military is exactly the same language as that used to describe the deal struck between like the Sudan People's Liberation Army and the National Congress Party in 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. It's the same language that's used, right down to phrases like preventing bloodshed and all of that. It's because the internationals are. There's been 30 years of peacemaking, and if you look at something like Sharaf Srinivasan's recent book on peacemaking in Sudan and how it operates, a lot of that same logic of quote-unquote stability and preventing bloodshed is now being applied to what is a moment, what is a movement of socio-revolutionary transformation through civil protest at an urban throughout Sudan, and it's just, it just doesn't work in the same way as the internationals have often assumed it does. And the most famous, the most blatant example was when the various international actors, I won't list them all by name, EU, UN, the Troika, reacted to that deal that Hamdok and Burhan struck in November 2021, without even waiting to see the reaction in Sudan and the reaction on the street. They just said this looks like a step forward immediately without waiting to see the popular mobilisation against it.
Thank you. With regard to especially to Hemeti, we are talking about him as, we're talking about two parties, civilians and militaries, and I think we tend to forget that he's not even a military. He's now he has a military title, but he's not even a military man. He's an illiterate man who managed to go up the ladder with the Bashir and the rest, and he's a he's a militia man. He's a militia leader, and myself, I always think of him and his family. It's not only him, his brother, I think, and his other two brothers or family, or the family which I tend to think about them similar to the drugs cartel in Latin America, except that they probably don't deal with drugs. They deal with arms and guns and everything else. And they manage to be on the top. And gold, yes, and gold.
And drugs.
And drugs as well. I didn't know that. And drugs as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the third thing.
Amphetamines and
is it coming?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. Okay. So they're a cartel sort of organizations. And is it just reasonable to talk about them, or simple to talk about them as part of the military? And the argument is between, or the struggle is between civilians and military. I think it's much more than that, especially if it's one just military man who can be thrown away easily, or the army can deal with him. That's simple, that's another issue. But I think we're not always addressing that Hemeti phenomenon, which is a very dangerous phenomenon in the history of Sudan, and needs to be looked at in a different way and dealt with it in a different way.
Yeah.
I'll just be interested in knowing your views about it.
No, I think you're quite right. And if you talk about comparisons with previous transitions, don't really see an actor like Hemeti in the previous transitions. I think actually in one of his chapters, Alex Duval describes Hemeti as the politics of Darfur, like coming back to haunt the civilian transition in Khartoum. I think we're seeing this play out now, right? In that you have Burhan. Burhan and Hemeti are more inclined towards different factions internationally, like Burhan more aligned towards Egypt, Hemeti more aligned towards the Gulf states and Saudi. You have the whole play where different political forces are moving more. Some are moving more towards Hemeti, some are moving more towards Burhan. We're seeing this playing out at the moment with the different workshops that are happening. One in Juba, one in Cairo. So I think Hemeti, it's it's going to be very, very interesting to see the role he plays if there is a transition to democracy, whether nominal or genuine, whether he acts as a funder of a political party, potentially a highly corrupt political party. I think it was very interesting to see the way that Sadiq al-Mahdi in particular, before his passing, tried to co-opt Hemeti politically and recognise him as a particularly significant actor. But again, he is, broadly speaking, in a sense, he's a continuity with 30 years of militia politics, dating back to about the mid-1980s and what Sharif Harir famously called the shortcut to decay. But he's, famously, I remember people saying this famously at the time of the Sissin massacre in 2019 when you saw the Rapid Support Force role in it. This was up till 2019, the militia politics was waging destruction in the marginalised regions in Darfur and the Mountains and elsewhere. 2019 was where it first hit Khartoum in a very major way, and I guess we don't know how that's going to play out in the long run. Yeah, you're right. Hey.
Thanks very much, Dr. Berridge. Actually, we're in rush of time, so I understand Dr. Berridge is going back to Newcastle, and really it's a pleasure to have you. And I think next time we might need to make a bit more multidisciplinary by bringing Justin Lynch and Alex Duan for further multidisciplinary for that. Thank you very much for having you, and we're probably going to get some more.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation, and it's been a pleasure being here. Thank you.